companies all over the United States, and I help them process work visas and permanent resident green cards. I also work a lot with colleges and universities across the country, helping them understand the work visa options that are available for international students. I do a lot of these Zoom presentations, and I think I have some kind of anti-technology force field because something always goes wrong. Audio goes out, video goes out, something like that. So my contact information is up on the screen right now. I encourage you to write that information down. If I do not get to answer a question that you have about how to deal with an international student, or if you are an international student and you have questions about staying and working in the United States that you don't get answered, feel free to give me a call, send me an email. I answer tons of questions from universities and from students for free every single year. So it's a useful resource. I encourage you to take advantage of that. So let's jump on in. So what we're going to talk about here in the next 45 minutes or so is how an international student attending a U.S. university is able to work in the United States, both while they are in school and then after graduation. And understand that the options available for an international student during a degree program before graduation are very different from the options available after graduation. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about both of those time periods, before graduation and after graduation. So when you talk about international students in the United States, they are in a temporary visa category. There are temporary visas in the United States that run from the letter A all the way down to the letter V, as in Victor. International students typically are in a category called F, F1 or J1. There may be international students in other visa categories, people who are dependents, children of somebody who is in a work visa like an H-1B or an L visa or an E visa. If you are an international student and you do not have an F or a J, or if you are dealing with an international student and they are not F or J, just tell them to call me or send me an email and I can answer their questions. The rules impacting students in a visa category other than F or J are very arcane and beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today, focusing on F1 students, because that's the vast majority of the international students that you will deal with. So let's jump to the options that are available for an F1 student. An F1 student is an international student attending an academic program in the United States. That's what the F1 visa category is all about. So if you're if an F1 student is on campus, before they graduate, they are very limited in the ways that they can work in the United States. The idea behind an F1 student is that you are supposed to be here to study. You're not supposed to be here to work. You're not supposed to be here to take a job from a US citizen. You're supposed to be here to study, get a degree, and then go back to your home country. But there are exceptions to that. And that is the US government acknowledges that there are circumstances where an F1 student should be permitted to work, particularly if it is to gain practical experience in their degree field. So if you look at the various options that are available for an international student to work during the degree program before graduation, I've listed them up here on the screen, and there are basically 5 options that allow an international student to work. First, they can work on campus. An international student can work on campus for a university employer, doing jobs like in the cafeteria or the university bookstore, or working for a professor or something like that. So they can engage in on-campus employment for a university employer. And I emphasize university employer because they can't work on campus, say, for an outside construction firm that's building a building on campus. It has to be a university-related employment. That's one option. The second option that is available for international students called Curricular Practical Training, CPT. CPT allows an international student, once they have completed one academic year, to work in the United States off campus for an employer if they are working, if their degree program has a work component that is an integral part of the degree program. What that means is, and I believe that your campus requires internships for all students, so all degree programs will have a work component that is part of the program. What that means is the international student can take advantage of curricular practical training. CPT does not require permission from the Immigration Service. All the student has to do is get authorization on their SEVIS record. SEVIS is the computer system that governs all international students. It stands for the Student and Exchange Visitor Information System, SEVIS. The SEVIS is the system that controls the I-20 form, which all students must have if they're going to attend school in the United States. So a student goes to the person that issues the I-20. That person authorizes the student for curricular practical training by annotating the I-20 form. The student is automatically eligible to work off campus. The work can be paid. It can be unpaid. It can be totally volunteer. As long as they are authorized for CPT, they can work off campus. It can be full-time. It can be part-time. If it is during the degree program and during the school year, it can only be part-time CPT. In breaks, it can be full-time. So curricular practical training is a great way for students to do, say, an internship, summer internship, something like that. They get authorized by the school. The school will state the begin date of the internship, the end date of the internship, and a student can use CPT to work off campus. The third option for international students called optional practical training. Optional practical training, CPT is only available to students that have a work component as part of their program. Optional practical training is available to every international student in F1 status. Optional practical training can be used before you graduate, or it can be kept until after graduation. Optional practical training is good for 12 months. Most international students will want to retain their optional practical training work eligibility, that 12 months of work eligibility, until after they graduate. Because OPT is a great way for students to get their foot in the door with an employer, because it gives them automatic work authorization that I'm going to talk about in just a couple of minutes. So the first three options are the ones that are the most common. You have on-campus employment, so a student can work on campus. You have curricular practical training that will allow them to work off campus in an internship authorized by the school. Optional practical training, most students will hold on to their OPT, the 12 months of optional practical training, until after they graduate. To take advantage of OPT, they must get a work card. That work card is issued by the Immigration Service. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how to get that work card. The fourth option available to students is if they suffer some sort of terrible economic hardship. Every international student, when they come to the United States, has to prove to the US government before they enter that they have the financial ability to support themselves for the duration of their degree program. Once they enter, sometimes terrible things happen. The home country falls into revolution or banking crisis and their parents' money is wiped out. If they are the subject of an extreme and unforeseen economic calamity, they may be able to qualify for economic hardship that will allow them to work off campus. They would have to apply to the Immigration Service to get that work authorization. They would have to prove what the extreme unforeseen calamity is, and then they would be authorized to work off campus. The fifth option is working for certain designated international organizations like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund. If a student gets an internship or a job opportunity with one of these international organizations, they'll know who they are, and they'll tell the student that they are authorized to allow the student to work. The student can reach out to me, contact me. I'm happy to explain that process. That's more than we need to get into here. I put the sixth option up there, which is volunteer work, because many career services offices will get questions from international students. They'll say, look, some of my US citizen friends are out working as unpaid interns, and I don't care if I'm paid. I just want to get the experience. I want to be able to put it on my resume. I don't want to use curricular practical training, and I don't want to use my optional practical training. Can't I just go and volunteer? And the answer is no. If you are working, if you're an international student and you are working off campus for an organization and you are providing a productive service for that organization, that's employment. And if you are employed, even if you are unpaid, that is unauthorized employment unless you are using curricular practical training, optional practical training. It is very inadvisable. There are certain exceptions to that rule, but in general, it is inadvisable for an international student to volunteer or work as an unpaid internship for an organization unless you're using CPT. If you use CPT, you are permitted to work and you can work even without pay. The problem comes if you don't get authorized for CPT and you just wander off campus and start working for an organization in the United States providing a productive service without proper employment authorization. That's where you run into trouble. So those are the options available for international students before they graduate. And those are the only work options available for international students. So let's say the student gets to graduation day and they're in their last semester. They come to the Career Services Office and they say, look, I want to go to work in the United States after graduation. I'd like to stay, work here for a while before going back to my home country, or maybe they never intend to go back to their home country. How can they stay and work in the US after graduation? Well, let's look. So here's a typical path that I find, and I've been practicing immigration law for about 28 years. And I've worked with thousands and thousands of international students over those years. This is the path that I find in my law practice that about 99% of every international student will follow to stay and work in the United States after graduation. There may be other options available, but again, about 99% of every international student will follow this path, and that is for F1 students, which is what we're going to focus on here. You're going to get your optional practical training after graduation. That will allow every international student to work for up to 12 months in the United States for any employer anywhere in the country, doing any job, as long as the job is related to the degree program. So optional practical training is the #1 best way for an international student to get their foot in the door with an employer. So they get 12 months of work authorization. Was I muted for a second? Okay, my fault. So every international student gets 12 months of optional practical training. They can then, if you are in a STEM degree program, science, technology, engineering, or math, you'll get an additional 24 months for a total of 36 months of work authorization in the United States using optional practical training. So while the student is using their optional practical training, whether it's for 12 months or 36 months, if they're in STEM, they're going to want to talk to the employer about filing for an H-1B. H-1B is the most common work visa in the United States. It will allow up to 6 years of work authorization in the United States after your optional practical training. While you're working using your H-1B, then you'll want to think about pursuing a permanent resident green card. So it's typically a 3-step process that international students use to work in the United States. They start with their optional practical training, then they move to the H-1B, and then they will pursue a permanent resident green card if it is their desire to stay longer in the United States. Now, let me take a second just to talk about green cards so that I can get that out of the way, because I get students ask me all the time, why can't I just get a green card? Seems like it'd be a lot easier. Green cards, true, it would be easier. It allows you to live for the rest of your life in the United States, work for any employer without restriction. You don't have to work at all if you don't want to. You can lay around on the beach all day. So getting a green card has great benefits to international students who graduate from U.S. universities. The problem is that there are only very few ways to get a green card, and they take a long time. One way to get a green card is through certain family relationships. If you have a family member who sponsors you for a green card, the family member must be either a parent who is a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, a spouse who is a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, a child who is a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident, or a brother or sister who is a U.S. citizen. Those categories of family members may be able to sponsor you for a green card. If you have questions about family-based permanent residence, send me an email, give me a call. I'm happy to talk to you about that. The other way to get a permanent resident green card is through employment. And that is if you have an employer who is willing to sponsor you and go through a very lengthy process to get you a permanent resident green card. At a minimum, that process will take at least 2 years. For citizens of China and India, it can be 7, 8, 9 years or longer because of various quota backlogs. But the first step always to getting a green card based on employment is to get an employer. I've never known an employer to sponsor somebody for a green card before they went to work, before the student went to work for the employer. So what you need to focus on when you are graduating and thinking about working in the United States, don't focus on trying to get a green card. Focus on the temporary visas that will allow you to stay and work. And as I said, the temporary visas are first, optional practical training for 12 months or up to 36 months. And then your H-1B, which will allow an additional 6 years of work. And it's while you're working using that H-1B that most students will pursue their permanent resident green card, either by marrying a U.S. citizen or having their employer sponsor them for a permanent resident green card. So let's look at the temporary visas that are available, the most common ways to stay. And that is number one, optional practical training, OPT. When you are if you're an international student, you're in the last semester of your degree program, you're going to want to start thinking about getting your optional practical training work card. OPT, as I said, the best way to stay and work in the United States after graduation, because it will allow 12 months of work authorization. You can work anywhere in the United States. The employer doesn't have to file any paperwork. The employer doesn't have to pay any fees. All they have to do is decide that they want to hire you. You can go to work for that employer as long as you have this little work card. It's called an employment authorization document, an EAD. You must have that card before you can go to work. You cannot go to work until you have that card in your hand. If you go to work before you get the card, you are deportable from the United States. If the employer puts you to work before you have that card, the employer will be fined by the federal government. So getting that card is very important. So here are some rules that you need to keep in mind to make sure that you get this card in your hand as early as possible after graduation. The first rule is that there is a window to apply for this card. The window is up to 90 days before graduation or up to 60 days after graduation. That's the window to apply for the card. So what I recommend to international students all the time is go back to your dorm or sit in your apartment or wherever you are, find your graduation date on a calendar, circle it, count back 90 days. That's the first day that you can submit your application to the Immigration Service to get this work card. And if there are people on campus who can assist with that work card, it's a form called an I-765. You should talk to folks on campus about how to do that. If there are no people on campus to help file this work card application, feel free to contact me. You have my email, my phone, and I can help you through that process. But the earliest you can apply, 90 days before graduation. And my recommendation is do not delay. You can apply anytime up to 60 days after graduation, but there is no reason to delay because you can't go to work until you have the card. And the earlier you apply, the more likely it is that you'll have that card close to a graduation date. And right now, it has taken the Immigration Service 90 to 120 days, in some cases 5 to 6 months to process those cards. And you can't go to work without the card, so the earlier you apply, the sooner you will get it, and the sooner you'll be able to go to work in the United States. So don't delay in applying for that card. Once you apply, you can remain in the United States until you actually get the card in your hand, so you don't have to depart while you're waiting for your work card. A very important issue with regard to optional practical training, you don't have to have a job offer to apply for the card. You don't even have to have started looking for a job. You're automatically eligible to apply for this card when you are in the last semester of your degree program, even if you don't have a job offer. So apply early. So once you get your optional practical training work card, you can go to work. You can work for up to 12 months. If you are in a STEM degree program, science, technology, engineering, or math, you can apply for an additional 24 months. So when you're at the end of your initial 12 months, you'll submit an application for an extended work card. That card will be issued for 24 months, giving you a total of 36 months of work authorization in the United States. But not every STEM grad will get that additional 24 months. To get the additional 24 months, you must be working for an employer enrolled in the government's E-Verify program. E-Verify is a program that requires employers to submit documentation to the federal government to prove that their whole workforce is legally authorized to work in the United States. Not every employer is enrolled in E-Verify. So if you are working for an employer not enrolled in the E-Verify program, you will not get the additional 24 months STEM extension. How can you know if the employer is enrolled in E-Verify? Ask them. Every employer will know if they are enrolled in the E-Verify program or not. And if they are not enrolled, and they decide they want to enroll so that you can get that STEM extension, they are certainly willing or free to do that. They can contact me and I'm happy to walk them through the pros and cons of enrolling in the E-Verify program. But that's a very important limitation on the STEM extension. So let's assume that you have you've listened to all this, you apply for your OPT work card, the card is in your hand, you go to work for an employer, you know that there's a clock ticking. You know that the OPT is going to expire in 12 months, or if you have a STEM degree, 36 months. And if you want to stay longer in the United States, you're going to need to get a longer term work visa. The most common longer term work visa for international grads of a US university, H-1B, far and away the most common. There are 3 requirements to qualify for an H-1B. Requirement number 1, you have to have an employer. When you got your OPT, you didn't have to have an employer. You could apply for that work card on your own. No employer involved at all. H-1B is different. H-1B can only be filed by an employer. You cannot file for H-1B on your own. Second requirement, you have to have a degree. You have to have at least a US bachelor's degree or higher, or a degree from anywhere in the world, as long as that degree is the equivalent of a US bachelor's degree. And there are organizations in the United States that will do degree equivalencies. We deal with them all the time. So you must have a degree either from the United States or from outside the United States that is the equivalent of a US degree. The third requirement, and this is the requirement that is the basis of almost every denial of an H-1B application. And H-1B applications under the Trump administration skyrocketed up from about, 11% of all the cases filed, up to 35% or more of all cases filed were denied. And the reason for denial was this third requirement, and that is the degree has to relate closely to the job. There has to be a very close correlation between the coursework that you took and the duties of the position of the job being offered. So what I do with, and coming out of our office, we have a denial rate for H-1Bs that is way less than 1%. And one of the reasons that it's very low is because we are very rigorous about going through the following exercise. And that is, I tell employers and I tell students, when you give a job offer, I want to see the top bullet pointed listing of the top 10 or 12 duties of the position. And then I want the student to go back through your transcript and tell me the coursework that you took that trained you to do each of those duties. And if you can make a close correlation between the duties and the coursework that you took, you'll have a strong H-1B. If you cannot make a strong correlation between your coursework and the duties of the position, you will not have a strong H-1B. So just to give you an example, let's say you graduate with a degree in accounting. You go to work for an accounting firm as an accountant, that's a great H-1B because the job requires a degree and it requires the type of degree that you have. But let's say you get your degree in accounting and on graduation day you decide you hate accounting but you love art and you want to be a museum curator. Okay, well, a museum curator is a sophisticated job, probably requires a degree, but it doesn't require the kind of degree that you have. A US person could go for that job, but to get an H-1B, you must show that your coursework relates to the duties of the position. You'll never be able to show that. Immigration Service will deny that H-1B. So very important for you as an international student to realize that whatever your degree field, make sure that you're going to find a job that is related to that degree closely. One common misconception for many employers is this last bullet point at the bottom of the screen. Many employers think that they have to first advertise to find a U.S. worker before they can sponsor for H-1B. Totally false. The employer does not need to advertise. They do not need to demonstrate that they're unable to find a U.S. worker. H-1B is automatically available to an international student as long as they have a degree and the degree relates closely to the duties of the job. So very important misconception. So once you get your H-1B, what does that give you? Well, what it gives you, what happens is the employer files an application, shows how your degree relates to the duties of the position. Immigration Service right now is taking about 5 months to process an H-1B application. Once they approve it, it is approved initially for 3 years. You can then apply for an additional 3 years for a total of 6 years in H-1B status. H-1B allows you only to work for the employer who filed the application. You cannot work for anybody else while you have that H-1B. So you can't get an H-1B and then work for the employer during the week and on weekends go sling lattes at Starbucks or run your own lawn business. You can only work for the employer who sponsored you for the H-1B. So does that mean that you're stuck with the same employer for 6 years? No, you can change and go to work for a new employer, but the new employer will have to file a new H-1B petition for you. Each time you change to a new employer, the new employer has to file a new H-1B. Why is that? Well, because it could be that the first job you had, it related closely to your degree program, but the new employer, maybe it doesn't relate so closely. So every time you change jobs, the Immigration Service wants to look at the duties of the position to see if the new job requires the type of degree that you have. Does that mean you get an extra 6 years every time you change? No. Total of 6 years in H-1B status, no matter how many employers you jump around to. So for example, let's say you graduate, you go to work for employer A. Employer A files an H-1B, gets a 3-year approval. 1 year in, you hate employer A, and you decide you want to go to employer B. Employer B will file an H-1B petition, and it will apply for 3 years. So you've had 1 year with employer A, 3 years with employer B. You'll only have 2 years of H-1B eligibility left with employer B or moving to somebody else. So it's 6 years total, no matter how many employers you jump around to. So let's look at some common issues that come up with the H-1B. And frequently when an international student is interviewing with an employer, the employer may say, well, I don't know what to do with an international student. And you can just tell them, give me a call. You have my contact information. I answer questions from employers for free all the time, year round. So if you're talking to an employer, they have questions about the process, tell them to give me a call, send me an email. One of the first questions they ask is, okay, well, how much is this going to cost me? Because I'll talk to them. I'll say, look, the student's going to get OPT, go to work for you. You don't have to do anything. Then you need to do the H-1B process. And they go, well, okay, well, how much is that going to cost me? There are 2 categories of cost for H-1B. First is an attorney fee, lawyer fee. That's my fee. Most companies do not have in-house expertise to process an H-1B petition, so they hire an attorney like me. In our office, we charge $2,600 to prepare an H-1B petition, $2,600. And then there is the Immigration Service filing fee. And there are all kinds of filing fees associated with the H-1B. In shorthand, the filing fees are the following. If you go to work for an employer with 25 or fewer employees, the filing fee is $1,710. If you go to work for an employer with more than 25 employees, the total filing fee is $2,460. So if you take my fee, $2,600, government filing fee, $2,460 if you're working for an employer with more than 25 employees, that's over $5,000 for an H-1B. And when I tell that to students, they always go, no employer is going to flush $5,000 down the drain to hire me. And it seems very depressing, but the answer is that's totally wrong. There are tens of thousands of employers who go through the H-1B process every single year. These fees do not scare employers. And what I tell employers all the time is these are nothing but recruiting expenses. They're like any other expense that you incur when you're recruiting. When they send recruiters out to college campuses, it costs money. When they advertise for jobs, it costs money. This is just a recruiting expense, and you're getting an excellent international worker for a relatively small amount of money. And most employers are not intimidated by these fees at all. I'd say over the years that I've been practicing immigration law, my office probably processed 25,000 or more H-1B petitions, and I can count on one hand or less the number of employers who decided not to go forward hiring an international graduate because of these fees. So these are not a problem. If the fees aren't a problem, what is a problem? Well, here's the biggest problem. And the biggest problem is the H-1B quota. H-1B is the most common work visa in the United States, but there is a limited quota. The quota is 85,000. Every single year, the government can approve 85,000 new H-1Bs. That is, H-1Bs for people who have never had H-1B before. Once you get your first H-1B, you never have to worry about this quota ever again. So if you get your first H-1B and you're applying for an extension, quota doesn't matter. If you're changing employers after you get your first H-1B, quota doesn't matter. But the very first time you're getting your H-1B, the quota matters. So let's talk about it because that's for most international students. The quota is divided into two different buckets. There is a bucket of 20,000 H-1B quota numbers available just to individuals with a U.S. advanced degree. That is, any degree above a bachelor's degree from a U.S. college or university. So if you get a U.S. master's degree, a U.S. PhD, a U.S. JD for lawyers, a U.S. MD for doctors, any degree above a bachelor's degree, you qualify for this advanced degree quota. Then there is a quota of 65,000, and that's for everybody else. Anybody who has a degree from anywhere. A master's degree from Canada, you're in the 65,000 quota. PhD from China, 65,000 quota. A bachelor's degree from the United States, you're in the 65,000 quota. So the quota has these two different buckets. Every year, the quota is released on October 1. So the quota year that we are in right now started October 1 of 2020, and it ends September 30 of 2021. So we're a little over halfway through the quota year. On October 1, 85,000 H-1Bs became available. And on October 1, all H-1Bs were taken. Every single one was taken on the very first day that they became available. And the reason for that is that employers can pre-file to try to get one of those quota numbers. And remember, when you're working using OPT, you want to get that H-1B because it's going to be about the only work visa option that's going to allow you to stay and work after your OPT in the United States. So employers can pre-file to try to get an H-1B quota number. Let's see how they pre-file. So up here on the screen is a chart of the H-1B quota year, a graph. So the quota year every year starts October 1. And it ends September 30 the following year. Employers, even though the whole quota is released on October 1, and it will stay for as long as it lasts, but it never lasts more than one day, because employers can pre-file to get it. Here's how they pre-file. Every year there is a pre-registration period that employers can file a pre-registration application with the United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, the USCIS. Employers file a pre-registration application during a designated pre-registration period. And that designated pre-registration period changes each year. This year, the pre-registration period is from March 9 to March 25. So right now we're about halfway through the pre-registration period. It will end next Friday. It ends March 25 at 11:59 in the morning. Anytime between March 9 and March 25, an employer will submit a pre-registration application. And that pre-registration application has very basic information. It basically says, here's the name of my company, XYZ Corporation. Here's our address. Here's a contact person. Here's our federal employer ID number. And here's some basic information about the person that we want to sponsor for H-1B. They'll give your name, your passport information, your date of birth, but no information about the job, no information about the wage, no information about your degree, nothing. Just basic information about the company, basic information about the individual that they want to sponsor. We submit that electronically. So between March 9 and March 25, every employer across the country that wants an H-1B submits a pre-registration. Starting up March 25 this year, the government will assemble all of the pre-registrations that were filed. Last year, during the pre-registration period in March of 2020, the government received over 275,000 H-1B pre-registrations for the 85,000 quota. So almost more than three times the number of quota numbers they received pre-registrations. So what they do, they assemble all the pre-registration applications, and they will randomly select 85,000 cases to process. That's called the H-1B lottery. So between the end of the pre-registration period, which this year is March 25, and April 1, so about a 6-day period, the government will do this random lottery. First, they will count out 20,000 advanced degree cases, and then they'll go back and they'll count out 65,000 of the regular quota. Once they've counted out 20,000 advanced degree and 65,000 of the regular quota, that's the whole quota. They'll notify all of the lucky winners. Your case has been selected in the H-1B lottery. They'll notify employers by April 1. Once an employer is notified that their case was selected for processing, then the employer will prepare a full H-1B petition. The employer will have 90 days to prepare the H-1B petition, which means they have up until June 30 to prepare and file the H-1B petition. And in that petition, they will show the job duties, your degree and how your degree relates to the job and all that kind of stuff. And then the Immigration Service will process the case and they will approve it. So that's the H-1B lottery program. Let's see how that works in actual practice. Let's assume that you are graduating in May. Lots of students graduate in spring. Let's say May 10 is graduation day. So graduation day is May 10, count back 90 days, file for your OPT. If you have an employer who is willing to sponsor you even before graduation, they can do that by filing a pre-registration application saying that you will have your degree by the time you file your H-1B petition. So they can file the pre-registration. You graduate in May. The Immigration Service will notify that employer whether your case was selected in the lottery by April 1. If you were selected in the lottery, then you'll have to wait till graduation. You get your degree, then you can file the H-1B petition. If the H-1B petition is approved, it will become effective on October 1 because that's when the quota is released. So even if you have an employer willing to file your H-1B before you graduate by doing the pre-registration in March, and if your case is approved, it still won't be approved until October 1. So how do you work between graduation day in May and October 1? OPT. It's the only way that you can do it. So even if you have an employer willing to sponsor you for H-1B, you still want to get your optional practical training so you can work up until October 1 when the H-1B is approved. Then and you don't have to leave the United States, you'll be approved right here in the US, and that will allow you to stay and work for an additional 6 years. Well, most students do not have employers who are willing to sponsor them before they graduate. Most employers want you to graduate first, you get your OPT work card, and you start to work after graduation. And you'll work and work and work, and October 1 comes, you don't care, you didn't have an application filed. You'll continue to work and work and work. Here's the March pre-registration period you're going to look for, which is the pre-registration the year after you graduate. So you're going to work using your OPT up until March of the following year, and whenever the Immigration Service announces the pre-registration period, you'll then file, your employer will file a pre-registration. At the end of the pre-registration period, the Immigration Service will assemble all the applications filed. They will notify lucky winners by April 1. Your employer will file the H-1B petition, and it will be approved and effective as of October 1, the year after you graduate. And in the meantime, you're going to want to work that entire time using your optional practical training. So that's the basic process for getting H-1B. There are other visa options that may be available to certain students. I've listed them up here on the screen. And Noelle, you can make this whole PowerPoint available to any student who wants to see it. But generally, if you are from one of the 5 countries across the top of the screen, there are great options that may be available to you. These other options are much more limited and available to almost no international students. I've had a few over the years who qualified for these. But the bottom line is this: if you're an international student, you need to plan ahead. You need to plan ahead much more than your U.S. colleagues. You need to plan ahead in the last semester of your degree program to make sure that you get your optional practical training work card. You need to plan ahead while you have that OPT work card to make sure you get your H-1B pre-registration filed. And then while you have your H-1B, you need to plan ahead to get your permanent resident green card if it is your desire to stay longer in the United States than the H-1B will allow. So that's the end of that presentation, and I'm happy to open it up to Noelle for whatever questions may be out there.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. That was a lot of information.
A lot of information, I know.
Super, but very well presented. Like, I felt like that was great. So I'm hoping that students can unmute themselves if they want. If not, I do have.
You've gone on mute.
I think you just muted yourself. I don't know if you're talking, but also there are some questions in the chat too.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm back now. Okay, so I will start with the few that I have here. Let's see, the first one was, is there a time limit? Example, hours per week and length of the internship on how much you can work in CPT. Like I said, there's a lot of information, so.
CPT can be part-time during the degree, during the school year, full-time during breaks. Part-time is no more than 20 hours. Full-time can be 40 hours or more, but during the school year, you can use CPT no more than part-time.
So in theory, you could do CPT all 4 years of college.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Another question is, should we ask the employer before starting the job that they apply for H-1B?
Well, most employers are going to let you know whether or not they are willing to sponsor. In fact, most of these computer programs that you allow you to apply for positions, they will always ask whether or not you are legally authorized to work in the United States. If you are asked on an application if you are legally authorized to work in the United States, you can answer that question yes, because you will have OPT, which allows you to work in the United States. But those questions are always followed by a question that says, will you now or in the future require employment visa sponsorship? And the answer to that is yes, you will require employment visa sponsorship. And when you answer that question, if the employer is not interested in pursuing, say, an H-1B, they'll just move on to the next candidate. But I encourage students all the time to answer those questions truthfully. If that employer you're talking to is not interested in pursuing employment visa sponsorship like an H-1B, thousands of employers are willing to do that. I mean, every year, over 270,000 pre-registrations are submitted. So there are huge numbers of employers willing to do it. And I promise you, it may not be the employers that recruit on campus, but most of the employers, there are lots of large employers that use H-1B. but far and away, the bulk of the H-1Bs are filed by small to mid-size employers, companies that have 100 employees or fewer, because they are very hungry to get the kind of talent that international students bring to the table. Big employers can get all kinds of qualified U.S. applicants. Smaller to mid-sized companies have trouble getting the highest graduating U.S. citizens, so they'll turn to international students. And it's a great way for you all to stay and work in the United States, smaller to mid-sized employers.
Great, thank you. On this, I'm thinking the person was thinking if you start with an employer and then you decide, no, I really am not happy here, I'm going to move on to a different employer. So the question is, should you work for the first employer until your second employer gets approved for the H-1B?
Well, when you go to work for your first employer and that employer files an H-1B, you get approved. So you're approved for 3 years. If you decide that you want to change to a new employer, you can, once the employer files the H-1B petition, you can transfer to that new employer right away. You do not have to wait for an approval. But the risk of doing that is that if the H-1B with the second employer ends up being denied, so right now it's taking the Immigration Service 5 or 6 months to process an H-1B. If that case gets denied, you have nothing. You've left your previous employer, and the H-1B with the second employer is denied, so you won't have anything. If you have a strong H-1B case, my recommendation almost always is go ahead and transfer, and we give that advice all the time. We have a very low percentage of denials out of our office. But if you think that your H-1B case is iffy, you may want to wait for an approval. Right now, as I said, it's taken 5 or 6 months, but you can, the employer can get an H-1B approved in 15 days by filing an extra filing fee. It's called premium processing. It's an extra $2,500, and the Immigration Service will process the case in 15 days.
You got to pay for that, though.
Got to pay for it. Got to pay for it.
This is another question that if I'm not asking it right, please, the person who is asking this, they can jump in. So they're wondering about the extended OPT, which I'm assuming is the STEM extension.
Yep.
Should you request the employer to file for the H-1B as soon as possible? And then she gives an example. So let's say you have 3 years of OPT. Should you ask already after year 1 for the employer to file so you have 2 extra years if the first application fails? It's a similar question.
Well, I mean, the more chances you play, the more likely you'll win. And if you don't file the first year, you've given up one of your chances. So the whole idea behind the STEM extension is to give international students in STEM degree programs multiple opportunities to apply for H-1B. If you don't get it the first year, you apply again the next year. If you don't get it then, you apply again the next year. If you throw one of those away, you're limiting your chances to get one of those quota numbers.
Okay. If you only have a year of OPT and you started working in the May or June after graduation, what can you do between June and October when the H-1B would activate? So that time period after the year.
Yeah, that's called, that's actually, there is a term for that, and it's called cap gap relief. Sounds like an antacid. And what cap gap relief means is that, let me go back to my graphic, it's kind of easier to see. So you graduate here in May, and your OPT is valid for 12 months, so it would expire here, right? Well, and it used to be that when your OPT expired, there was a gap between when your OPT expired and when the H-1B became effective on October 1. That's called the cap gap. It's a gap in your employment authorization caused by this ridiculous H-1B cap. So government used to say you had to leave the United States. Well, about 10 years ago, they woke up and took a happy pill or something and decided that that was a stupid rule. So they came up with cap gap relief. And what that says is that if you have OPT, if you file an H-1B petition, say on after April 1, as long as you file the H-1B petition before your OPT expires, then you will be able to extend your OPT automatically until October 1 when that H-1B is approved and effective. So the key is that if your employer is notified on April 1 that they were selected in the lottery, you need to make sure to get your H-1B petition filed before your OPT expires. And if you're able to do that, then CAP-GAP relief will give you work authorization until October 1.
Super, that was a great question. So the next one is, what if we don't get shortlisted for the H-1B and our 1-year OPT is over?
Well, no real good news there. You can go to work for one of these types of organizations. There are 4 categories of employers who are not subject to this quota. So you could get an H-1B with one of these types of organizations anytime. No quota for universities, for nonprofits affiliated with a university, for certain nonprofit research organizations, or for certain governmental research organizations. These employers, no quota for them. They can file H-1B anytime. They never run out. So you can go to try to get a job with one of these exempt organizations. That's obviously a very limited option. The other option, if you are from one of these 5 countries, Canada, Mexico, Chile, Singapore, Australia, there are great options available, similar to H-1B. They never run out. If you're from one of those countries, send me your information. I'm happy to explain what the options are. These other options are very limited. L1 is for individuals who work for multinational companies. You first have to work outside the US and then transfer back in. E-visa is for individuals from certain countries that have treaties of trade and commerce with the United States. Obviously a very limited option. So what most students do if they fail to get selected in the lottery is they either go home or they re-enroll in school, re-enroll in a new degree program and use curricular practical training to work. It's a very expensive way to stay in the US, but there are unfortunately very limited work visa options.
Great. And the last question is, can you do both H-1B and graduate school?
When you get H-1B, your primary reason for being in the United States has to be your H-1B employment. So primarily you have to work. You can attend school on a part-time basis, but not full-time.
Great, thank you. Mark, would you mind showing that last slide with your contact info on it? And maybe the students could snap a picture of it. We'll also have it, of course, but just for their immediate reference.
Yep, no problem.
Great, thank you. And if there's any last questions, we're going to wrap up in just a little bit here.
I have one question.
Sure.
First of all, I want to say thank you for taking the time to present all the useful information for us. So for me, I mean, if you can go back to your slide in which you divided the 2 buckets, like the 20,000. Yes, this one.
Yep.
So, like, an international student who has like a PhD means that this student is going to have like higher chances of like getting an H-1B from someone who has just like a bachelor's or a master's.
Well, if you have an advanced degree, there's all kinds of misinformation about the benefit of a PhD. There have been many proposals to, say that if you get a PhD, you get an H-1B attached to it. None of those proposals have gone anywhere. So there are only 2 categories in this quota. There's the advanced degree quota. So anybody with an advanced degree, master's, PhD, any advanced degree, they're all in that same bucket. PhD doesn't get any particular benefit over above a master's degree, but you do get a benefit. And the benefit is this. When they do the quota, so last year they had 275,000 cases. What they will do first When you submit your pre-registration, you check off a little box that says whether or not you are advanced degree. They'll take all the advanced degree cases first. So let's say there were 90,000 advanced degree cases out of that 275,000. They take all the advanced degree, they count out 20,000. That's the advanced degree quota. Then they take all the remaining 70,000, they put it back into the pile, they mix it all up, and then they count out 65,000. So you get 2 chances at the quota if you have an advanced degree.
That makes sense. Thank you so much.
Well, I'm glad it makes sense to you because it doesn't make sense to anybody else in the world, I can tell you that.
All right, well, I do want to be respectful of everybody's time here, but again, Mark, I appreciate your time. This was super, super educational and informative. So if students, if you didn't get your questions answered, go ahead and either reach out to Mark or us for his information and we'll get that to you, or maybe even at this point we can answer it. So thanks again.